What do you do when you're born to rule an empire that spans a quarter of the Earth's surface, but the only thing you truly want is the one thing you cannot have? December 11th, 1936. A king sits in a broadcasting room at Windsor Castle, about to speak words no British monarch has ever spoken in 1,000 years of history. I have found it impossible to carry the heavy burden of responsibility and to discharge my duties as king as I would wish to do without the help and support of the woman I love. Outside, 400 million subjects across the British Empire listen in stunned silence. In a few minutes, he will no longer be their king. He will be a man who traded the greatest throne on earth for a twice-divorced American woman with a questionable past. This is the story of Edward VIII, a story about obsession disguised as love, duty abandoned for desire, and how one decision destroyed not just a reign, but a man's entire sense of purpose. What happened to Edward after he gave up everything reveals something we all need to understand about the price of choosing passion over responsibility. To understand Edward's story, you have to understand the weight of the name he carried and the throne he inherited. The House of Windsor, though they'd only been called that since 1917 when anti-German sentiment forced them to abandon their Saxe-Coburg-Gotha surname, represented something far more ancient and powerful than a simple family name. They were the living embodiment of the British Empire, the largest empire in human history. When Edward was born in 1894, Queen Victoria still sat on the throne. She ruled over nearly 400 million people, almost a quarter of the world's population. The British Empire stretched across every continent, covering 13 million square miles. The sun literally never set on British territory. To be born into the Windsor family wasn't just privilege. It was to be born into a role that transcended individual human existence. You weren't just a person. You were a symbol, an institution, a living connection to centuries of tradition and power. Edward's grandfather, Edward VII, would ascend to the throne in 1901 after Victoria's death. His father, George V, would become king in 1910. The wealth and power were almost incomprehensible. The Crown estate alone was valued at hundreds of millions of pounds, billions in today's currency. But it wasn't about money. The Windsors didn't just have wealth. They had Buckingham Palace, Windsor Castle, Sandringham House, Balmoral Castle. They had the crown jewels, including the imperial state crown containing 2,868 diamonds, 17 sapphires, 11 emeralds, 269 pearls, and 4 rubies. They had the loyalty of parliaments, armies, and navies spanning the globe. But more than the physical trappings, they had something intangible and irreplaceable: legitimacy, divine right, the sense that they were chosen by God and history to rule. When a Windsor spoke, prime ministers listened. When a Windsor appeared, crowds of thousands would gather just to glimpse them. The British people didn't just respect the monarchy. They loved it, needed it, built their entire sense of national identity around it. To be the heir to this empire meant carrying expectations that would crush most men. You were raised from birth knowing that your life was not your own. Your duty was to the crown, to the empire, to history itself. Personal desires, individual happiness, these were luxuries you could not afford. You married for dynastic purposes. You produced heirs to continue the line. You performed your role with dignity and restraint. You never ever put your own wants above the institution you represented. This was the world Edward Albert Christian George Andrew Patrick David Windsor, known to his family as David, was born into on June 23, 1894, at White Lodge in Richmond Park, Surrey. From his first breath, his life was not his own. He was third in line to the throne. When his grandfather died in 1910, he became second in line. When his father became King George V, Edward became Prince of Wales and heir apparent, the future Emperor of India. the future king of Great Britain and the British dominions, the future head of the largest empire the world had ever known. The pressure on him was immense from the very beginning. His father, King George V, was a stern, uncompromising man who believed absolutely in duty, tradition, and the suppression of personal feelings. George V had been raised in the Royal Navy, where discipline and obedience were paramount. He brought that same rigid mindset to parenting. He believed that showing affection would weaken his children, make them unfit for the responsibilities they would carry. Edward would later write about his childhood with barely concealed bitterness. His father, he said, was frightening and created an atmosphere of chronic misery in the household. George V would inspect his children like a naval officer inspecting cadets, criticizing their posture, their uniforms, their deportment. Any sign of emotion was weakness. Any deviation from protocol was failure. The message was clear. You are not a child. You are a future king. Act like it. Edward's mother, Queen Mary, was equally cold. Born Princess Victoria Mary of Teck, she was the daughter of a minor German duke and had been raised in relative poverty by royal standards. She had originally been engaged to Edward's uncle, Prince Albert Victor, who died suddenly of influenza in 1892. Pragmatically, she then married Albert Victor's younger brother, the man who would become George V. It was a marriage of duty, not love. Mary understood that her role was to produce heirs and maintain royal dignity. Personal warmth was not part of the job description. Years later, Edward would recall that his mother never hugged him, never offered comfort when he was upset, never showed the kind of maternal affection that most children take for granted. I never had a single, intimate conversation with my mother, he would say. When he fell and scraped his knee as a child, he was told to stop crying and behave like a prince. When he struggled with his studies, he was told that failure was not an option for an heir to the throne. Edward was born at White Lodge, Richmond Park, on June 23, 1894, during the last years of Queen Victoria's reign. His birth was celebrated across the empire with gun salutes, church services, and public rejoicing. The baby prince was third in line to the throne, behind his grandfather Edward VII and his father George. But everyone knew that, barring tragedy, this child would one day be king. From his earliest days, Edward's life was governed by rigid protocol and suffocating formality. He and his younger siblings, Albert, the future George VI, Mary, Henry, George, and John, were raised primarily by nannies and tutors in a separate household from their parents. The children would be brought to see their parents for precisely 1 hour each evening, dressed in their finest clothes, expected to stand at attention and speak only when spoken to. If they misbehaved, they were immediately removed and punished. Edward's primary nanny was later discovered to have been emotionally disturbed. She would pinch and twist Edward's arm viciously before bringing him to see his parents, so that he would cry and scream in their presence. This went on for 3 years before anyone noticed something was wrong. When the nanny was finally dismissed, no one thought to consider what psychological damage might have been done to the young prince. The focus was always on his behavior, his performance, his fitness for future kingship, never on his emotional well-being. Despite the coldness of his parents, Edward showed early signs of charm and charisma that would later define his public persona. He was a beautiful child with golden hair and striking blue eyes. Even as a small boy, he had a gift for connecting with people, for making them feel seen and valued. When he smiled, people melted. This natural warmth and accessibility would later make him enormously popular with the British public, and would also make his eventual abdication all the more shocking. But there were also early signs of the restlessness and emotional neediness that would plague him throughout his life. Edward craved approval, affection, and attention in a way that seemed insatiable. No amount of public adoration could fill the void left by his parents' coldness. He was deeply insecure despite his privileged position, constantly seeking validation and reassurance. Friends who knew him as a child remember that he would become almost desperate when he felt ignored or rejected, clinging to anyone who showed him genuine warmth. Edward's education followed the traditional path for royal heirs, but it was clear from early on that he was not a natural scholar. He attended the Royal Naval College at Osborne on the Isle of Wight, starting in 1907, then the Royal Naval College at Dartmouth. He was a mediocre student at best, struggling with mathematics and languages. But what he lacked in academic ability, he made up for in personal magnetism. His fellow cadets liked him. The instructors found him charming despite his academic shortcomings. He had a gift for making people want to help him, protect him, even cover for his failures. In 1911, at age 16, Edward was formally invested as Prince of Wales in an elaborate ceremony at Carnarvon Castle in Wales. The ceremony was a spectacular piece of royal theatre, designed to reinforce the connection between the crown and the Welsh people. Edward wore a specially designed costume that made him look like a character from a medieval romance: white satin breeches, a purple velvet mantle, and a coronet. He later described the outfit as preposterous and said he felt like a fool wearing it. But the public loved it. Thousands gathered to watch the ceremony. Newspapers gushed about the handsome young prince. Edward had become, at 16, one of the most photographed and admired young men in the world. The pressure to live up to this idealized image would only grow stronger as he got older. After his investiture, Edward went up to Oxford University, where he studied at Magdalen College. His time at Oxford was academically undistinguished, but socially active. He joined the university's Officer Training Corps and developed a passion for hunting, polo, and other aristocratic pursuits. He also began his first tentative exploration of romance, though always under the watchful eye of his handlers, who were determined to prevent any scandal. Then came August 1914, and everything changed. When the First World War erupted in August 1914, Edward was 20 years old and desperate to serve. He wanted to be at the front, to prove his courage, to experience the same dangers as the young men who were flooding recruitment offices across Britain. But his father and the military commanders absolutely forbade it. The heir to the throne could not be allowed to risk his life in combat. If he were killed or captured, it would be a catastrophic blow to British morale. Edward was furious. "What difference does it make if I am killed?" he reportedly said. "I have 4 brothers." But his protests were ignored. Instead, he was given a staff position with the British Expeditionary Force in France, where he could visit the front lines but was never allowed into actual combat. Officers were given strict orders to keep the prince away from any real danger. This should have been a humiliating, frustrating experience. And in many ways, it was. Edward chafed constantly at the restrictions placed on him, but it also ended up being one of the most transformative and positive periods of his life. Despite being kept from combat, Edward won the respect and affection of the troops through his genuine desire to share their hardships as much as he was allowed. He slept in the same muddy dugouts, he ate the same rations, he visited field hospitals and spoke with wounded soldiers, showing real compassion and interest in their welfare. The soldiers loved him for it. Here was a prince who didn't hide behind his privilege, who genuinely seemed to care about the ordinary men fighting and dying in the trenches. Stories spread about Edward's visits to the front, his willingness to get his boots muddy, his friendly conversations with common soldiers. The press played up these stories, and Edward became a symbol of a new, more accessible kind of royalty, a prince of the people, not just of the palace, just. Edward thrived on this adoration. For perhaps the first time in his life, he felt genuinely loved and appreciated not for his title, but for who he was as a person. The warmth and approval he had never received from his parents, he now received from crowds of adoring soldiers and civilians. It was intoxicating. It was also dangerous because it fed his desperate need for external validation and made him increasingly dependent on public approval for his sense of self-worth. The war ended in November 1918, with Britain victorious but forever changed. Nearly 900,000 British servicemen had been killed. An entire generation had been scarred by the horror and futility of trench warfare. The old certainties were gone. The rigid class system was beginning to crack. The empire that had seemed eternal was starting to show signs of strain. And Edward, now 24 years old, was more popular than ever, the handsome, charming Prince of Wales who had tried to share the dangers of war with his future subjects. In the years immediately following the war, Edward embarked on a series of royal tours designed to strengthen the bonds between Britain and the Dominions, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa. These tours were spectacular successes. Edward's natural charisma and apparent accessibility made him a sensation wherever he went. Massive crowds turned out to see him. Young women swooned. Men wanted to shake his hand. The press coverage was overwhelmingly positive. Edward loved every minute of it. The adulation, the attention, the feeling of being loved by millions. It filled some deep void inside him. But it also reinforced his growing sense that he was special, that normal rules didn't apply to him, that his personal happiness mattered more than dusty old traditions. He began to feel increasingly trapped by the formal strictures of his position. He wanted freedom. He wanted to live his own life. He wanted more than anything to find someone who loved him for himself, not for his title. What he didn't realize was that his title and himself were inseparable. You couldn't have one without the other, and the search for unconditional personal love would eventually destroy everything he had been born to be. Throughout the 1920s and early 1930s, Edward established a pattern that would ultimately lead to his downfall. He fell in love, repeatedly and obsessively, with married women. This wasn't just a matter of casual affairs or discreet relationships. Edward became emotionally dependent on these women in a way that alarmed his friends and family. He needed to be needed. He craved the kind of maternal affection and unconditional acceptance he had never received from his own mother. And he seemed to find it only with women who were unavailable, already committed to other men. His first serious relationship was with Freda Dudley Ward, the wife of a Liberal MP. They met in 1918 during a Zeppelin raid, when Freda took shelter in the same doorway as Edward and a friend. The relationship would last 16 years. Edward was utterly devoted to her. He wrote her letters constantly, sometimes multiple times a day. He telephoned her obsessively. He rearranged his schedule to accommodate her availability. Friends described him as besotted and desperate in his attachment to Freda. Freda, for her part, seems to have genuinely cared for Edward, but she also maintained clear boundaries. She had no intention of leaving her husband or disrupting her comfortable life. She enjoyed the excitement and glamour of being the Prince of Wales's mistress, but she never lost sight of the fact that this relationship could never be permanent or officially acknowledged. This very unavailability may have been part of what Edward found so appealing. He could pour all his emotional neediness into the relationship without ever having to face the reality of actual commitment and adult responsibility. After Freda came Thelma Furness, Viscountess Furness, an American-born socialite who was married to a shipping magnate. Edward and Thelma began their relationship in 1930, and once again Edward displayed the same pattern of obsessive devotion and emotional dependency. He showered Thelma with gifts, attention, and declarations of love. He sulked when she spent time with other people. He behaved, friends noted, less like a confident prince than like an insecure adolescent terrified of abandonment. It was Thelma Furness who would inadvertently engineer Edward's meeting with the woman who would change his life forever, Wallis Simpson. Wallace Warfield was born on June 19, 1896, in Blue Ridge Summit, Pennsylvania, though she was raised primarily in Baltimore, Maryland. Her father died when she was 5 months old, leaving her mother in precarious financial circumstances. Wallace grew up on the margins of Baltimore society, not quite poor, but never secure, always aware that her family's social position was fragile and maintained only through the charity of wealthier relatives. This background shaped Wallace profoundly. She learned early that survival required charm, wit, and the ability to make yourself indispensable to more powerful people. She developed a sharp tongue, a talent for entertaining, and an instinct for identifying and attaching herself to men who could provide the security and status she craved. She was not conventionally beautiful. Her features were too angular, her frame too thin, but she had style, confidence, and a kind of fierce, determined energy that many men found compelling. Wallace married her first husband, Earl Winfield Spencer, Jr., a U.S. Navy pilot, in 1916. The marriage was troubled from the start. Spencer was an alcoholic who became abusive when drunk. Wallace left him multiple times before the divorce was finally finalized in 1927. During and after her first marriage, Wallace lived in various cities including Washington, D.C., China, and New York, always moving in social circles slightly above her actual financial means, always cultivating relationships with people who could help her advance. In 1928, Wallace married Ernest Aldrich Simpson, an American-born British shipping executive. Simpson was solid, reliable, and prosperous, everything her first husband hadn't been. They settled in London, where Wallace threw herself into cultivating the kind of smart, sophisticated social circle she had always aspired to join. She was witty, an excellent hostess, and not afraid to voice strong opinions, qualities that made her popular in certain avant-garde social circles. It was in London that Wallace met Thelma Furness, who was then Edward's mistress. The two women became friends. And in January 1931, Thelma brought Wallace to a party where she would meet the Prince of Wales for the first time. The meeting was unremarkable. Edward barely noticed Wallace. She was just another American woman in Thelma's circle. But over the next few years, as Wallace and Ernest Simpson were occasionally invited to events where Edward was present, Edward began to pay more attention. Wallace was different from the aristocratic English women he usually encountered. She was direct, funny, irreverent. She teased him. She didn't simper or flatter excessively. She treated him like a person, not like a prince. For Edward, who had been surrounded by sycophants his entire life, this was intoxicating. Then came January 1934. Thelma Furness traveled to America to visit her sister. Before she left, she made a fateful request. She asked Wallace to look after Edward while she was gone. It was meant as a casual favor between friends. It turned into a catastrophe. While Thelma was in America, Edward and Wallace began spending increasing amounts of time together. At first it was just social, dinners, parties, weekends at Edward's country house, Fort Belvedere. But something was shifting. Edward was transferring his obsessive emotional dependency from Thelma to Wallace. And Wallace, sensing an opportunity for security and status far beyond anything Ernest Simpson could provide, encouraged the attachment. When Thelma returned from America, she found herself completely cut off. Edward stopped taking her calls. He was now entirely focused on Wallace. Thelma was devastated and bewildered. She had assumed her position in Edward's life was secure. She had underestimated both Edward's capacity for sudden, complete emotional transfer and Wallace's ruthless ambition. By 1935, it was clear to anyone paying attention that Edward was obsessed with Wallace Simpson. He showered her with jewelry, emeralds, rubies, diamonds. He spent every available moment with her. He began taking her on trips, including a highly publicized Mediterranean cruise where they were photographed together, looking very much like a couple. The British press, following an informal agreement not to publish scandalous stories about the royal family, maintained silence. But foreign newspapers, particularly in America, began reporting openly on the affair between the Prince of Wales and the married American woman. Edward's family was appalled. His father, King George V, had suspicions about his son's behavior, but refused to confront the situation directly. His mother, Queen Mary, was horrified by the breach of propriety, but equally reluctant to address it openly. The British establishment, government officials, church leaders, senior courtiers, watched with growing alarm as the heir to the throne made a spectacle of himself with a twice-married American woman. I think it's important to understand that this wasn't just about snobbery or prejudice against Americans, though those factors certainly played a role. The fundamental issue was constitutional. The King of England was also the supreme governor of the Church of England. The Church of England did not recognize divorce. If Edward married a divorced woman, he would be violating the core principles of the church he was supposed to lead. It would create a constitutional crisis that could potentially bring down the monarchy itself. But Edward didn't care. Or more accurately, he couldn't see beyond his own emotional needs. He had convinced himself that Wallis was the only person who truly understood him, the only person who loved him for himself rather than his title. He needed her. Without her, he believed, his life would be empty and meaningless. The idea of giving her up was literally inconceivable to him. In January 1936, King George V died. Edward was now King Edward VIII. He was 41 years old. He had spent his entire life preparing for this moment, and the first thing he did as king was make it clear that he had no intention of giving up Wallis Simpson. Edward's reign began under a cloud of anxiety and uncertainty. Those close to the new king knew about his relationship with Wallis Simpson. They knew it would have to be addressed. But Edward seemed to exist in a state of denial about the impossibility of his situation. He genuinely believed, or convinced himself, that he could remain king and marry Wallis. Wallis, meanwhile, was going through the process of divorcing Ernest Simpson. The divorce proceedings began in October 1936. This timing was not coincidental. Wallis was making herself available for marriage, and Edward was determined that she would be his wife and his queen. The problem was that virtually everyone else in the British establishment was equally determined that this would never happen. Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin, a shrewd and experienced politician, understood that the monarchy's survival depended on maintaining public respect and moral authority. A king married to a twice-divorced American woman would fatally undermine that authority. The Church of England would be outraged. The Dominions, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, were already expressing concerns. Public opinion, once it became fully aware of the situation, would likely turn sharply against the king. Baldwin arranged a series of meetings with Edward to discuss the situation. These conversations were awkward, painful, and ultimately futile. Baldwin would delicately suggest that Edward might need to choose between the throne and Mrs. Simpson. Edward would respond with variations on the same theme. He could not live without Wallis. He would not give her up. Surely some arrangement could be made. Various solutions were proposed and rejected. Could Wallis be Edward's wife but not queen? A morganatic marriage where she would have no royal title or status. The Dominion governments were consulted and flatly refused to accept such an arrangement. Could the situation simply be kept quiet, with Wallis as the king's mistress? But Wallis herself wanted marriage, wanted recognition, wanted to be queen. And Edward, in his obsessed state, could deny her nothing. The crisis came to a head in early December 1936. The British press, which had maintained its silence for months, finally broke the story. Headlines screamed about the king's relationship with a divorced American woman. The public, which had been largely unaware of the situation, was shocked. Opinion was divided. Some sympathized with Edward and his desire for personal happiness. Others were scandalized and angry that the king would put his own desires above his duty. On December 3, 1936, Baldwin told Edward bluntly that he could not remain king and marry Wallis Simpson. The choice was binary, the throne or the woman. Edward would have to decide. Edward chose Wallis. Looking back at everything that followed, I think this is the moment that reveals the fundamental tragedy of Edward's character. He had spent his entire life performing the role of prince, of heir, of future king. But he had never actually developed a true sense of duty or purpose beyond seeking approval and affection. When forced to choose between abstract duty and concrete emotional need, he chose emotion. He couldn't imagine life without Wallis. He could imagine life without the throne. On December 10, 1936, Edward signed the instrument of abdication. He was king for less than 11 months, one of the shortest reigns in British history. He never had a coronation. He never wore the crown. He gave it all up for a woman who, many historians now believe, didn't even love him as deeply as he loved her. December 11, 1936. Edward travelled to Windsor Castle to make his abdication speech, which would be broadcast via radio to the nation and the empire. His brother Albert, now King George VI, was with him, as were other family members. But Wallis was not there. She had fled to France to escape the media frenzy, staying at a villa owned by friends. At 10 p.m., Edward sat before a microphone in a room at Windsor Castle and spoke to his former subjects. The speech had been carefully prepared, reviewed by advisors, edited and re-edited. But when Edward delivered it, the emotion in his voice was unmistakable. "At long last I am able to say a few words of my own," he began. "I have never wanted to withhold anything, but until now it has not been constitutionally possible for me to speak. A few hours ago I discharged my last duty as king and emperor, and now that I have been succeeded by my brother, the Duke of York, my first words must be to declare my allegiance to him. This I do with all my heart." He spoke about the burden of kingship, about the impossibility of carrying that burden without the help and support of the woman I love. He praised his brother, the new king. He expressed hope for the future. And he ended with words that would echo through history. "God bless you all. God save the king." Across Britain and the Empire, people listened in stunned silence. Many were moved by Edward's obvious sincerity and emotion. Others were angry, feeling betrayed by a king who had put personal desire above duty. The reaction was mixed, complicated, deeply emotional on all sides. For Edward's family, the abdication was a catastrophe. His brother Albert, now George VI, had never expected or wanted to be king. He was shy, suffered from a severe stammer, and felt completely unprepared for the role. But he would rise to the occasion, guided by his wife Elizabeth, later the Queen Mother, and a fierce sense of duty that his older brother had lacked. George VI would lead Britain through World War II with quiet courage and dedication. He would restore respect and affection for the monarchy that Edward's abdication had damaged. But George VI would also pay a price. The stress of the unexpected kingship would damage his health. He would die in 1952 at age 56, worn down by the responsibilities that should never have been his. His widow, Queen Elizabeth, would never forgive Edward for putting that burden on her husband. After the abdication, Edward was given the title Duke of Windsor. He left Britain immediately, travelling to Austria and then to France, where he was reunited with Wallis. On June 3, 1937, at a chateau in France, Edward and Wallis were married. It was a small, quiet ceremony, nothing like the grand royal wedding Edward might have had. No member of the British royal family attended. Edward's mother, Queen Mary, had forbidden them to attend as a mark of her disapproval. This absence haunted the wedding. Edward had given up everything for this moment, and it was marred by the rejection of his family the absence of official recognition, the knowledge that Wallis would never be called Her Royal Highness, a title Edward desperately wanted her to have. The British government had specifically denied Wallis the style of Royal Highness, a petty but calculated insult that Edward felt keenly. In the early months of their marriage, Edward and Wallis tried to create a life for themselves in France. They lived in borrowed houses, moved in wealthy social circles, attended parties and dinners. Edward had a substantial income from investments and property in Britain, so they were not poor by any normal standard. But they were also not wealthy enough to support the kind of lavish lifestyle they wanted without careful management. And more critically, they had no purpose. Edward was no longer king. He held no official position. He had no duties, no responsibilities, nothing to do with his time and energy. This purposelessness would corrode Edward for the rest of his life. He had been raised from birth with one single purpose: to be king. Now that purpose was gone, and there was nothing to replace it. He couldn't return to Britain without government permission. He was effectively in exile. And the grand romantic gesture of abdication was revealed as exactly that, a gesture. The reality was emptiness, boredom, and a growing sense that perhaps the sacrifice had been too great. Then came October 1937, and Edward made one of the most catastrophic decisions of his life. He and Wallis accepted an invitation to visit Nazi Germany. Edward and Wallis's visit to Germany in October 1937 was a propaganda coup for Adolf Hitler and a public relations disaster for Edward. The Duke and Duchess of Windsor, as they were now styled, were given the full treatment. Meetings with Hitler, tours of factories, lavish receptions. Photographs show Edward giving what appears to be a Nazi salute. He and Wallis were clearly treated as honored guests of the Third Reich. Why did Edward do this? The reasons are complex and contested. Some historians argue that Edward was genuinely sympathetic to fascism and admired Hitler's strong leadership. Others suggest he was simply naive and foolish, easily manipulated by Nazi officials who saw him as a useful idiot. Still others claim Edward believed he was conducting unofficial diplomacy, trying to prevent another war between Britain and Germany. Whatever his motivations, the visit was a catastrophe for his reputation. The British government was furious. The royal family was horrified. The British public, increasingly aware of Nazi atrocities, was disgusted. Edward had already abdicated for love. Now he appeared to be cozying up to Britain's future enemy. Any remaining sympathy for him evaporated. When World War II broke out in September 1939, Edward was in France. He offered his services to Britain but was met with suspicion and reluctance. Eventually, he was given a minor position with the British military mission in France, a role that kept him occupied but far from any real power or sensitive information. The British government didn't trust him. There were concerns that he might be sympathetic to Nazi Germany or, at minimum, that he couldn't be trusted with sensitive information. When France fell to the Nazis in June 1940, Edward and Wallis fled to Spain and then to Portugal. Both countries were officially neutral but had pro-Nazi sympathies. The British government, now led by Winston Churchill, was desperate to get Edward out of Europe. There were even Nazi plots to kidnap Edward and use him as a puppet king if Germany successfully invaded Britain. To solve the problem, Churchill arranged for Edward to be appointed governor of the Bahamas, a British colonial territory in the Caribbean. It was clearly a form of exile disguised as an official posting, a way to keep Edward far from Europe, far from Britain, far from any place where he might cause trouble. Edward knew it. He resented it. But he had little choice but to accept. From 1940 to 1945, Edward served as governor of the Bahamas. It should have been a chance for him to prove his worth, to demonstrate that he could still serve his country in some meaningful capacity. But Edward's time in the Bahamas was largely ineffectual. He performed the ceremonial duties of the position adequately, but showed little real interest in the welfare of the Bahamian people, most of whom were poor and black. He was more concerned with maintaining his social life, entertaining wealthy visitors, and complaining about his exile from Britain. The one significant event during his tenure was the outbreak of riots in Nassau in 1942, sparked by poor working conditions and discrimination against black Bahamian workers. Edward's response was inadequate and revealed the limitations of his understanding and empathy. He viewed the riots primarily as a threat to order, rather than as a legitimate expression of grievances. His racial attitudes, typical of his class and era but still disturbing, prevented him from truly engaging with the underlying issues. When the war ended in 1945, Edward hoped he might be allowed to return to Britain and resume some kind of official role. But the new Labour government, like the previous Conservative governments, had no interest in giving Edward any position of responsibility. He was seen as unreliable, self-centered, and potentially damaging to the monarchy. His brother, King George VI, remained cold toward him. The rest of the royal family kept their distance. So Edward and Wallis returned to France, where they would spend the rest of their lives. They lived in a mansion in the Bois de Boulogne in Paris, provided by the French government. They traveled extensively, entertained lavishly, and moved through the international social circuit of wealthy, titled, largely purposeless people. To the outside world, they appeared to live a life of glamour and privilege. But inside, there was a growing emptiness. Edward had given up the throne for Wallis. But what had he actually gained? A woman who, by many accounts, grew increasingly cold and domineering as the years went on. Friends observed that Wallis seemed to resent Edward, as if she blamed him for the isolation and lack of official recognition that followed the abdication. She flirted openly with other men at parties. She made cutting remarks about Edward in public. She seemed to take a perverse pleasure in diminishing him, and Edward endured it all. He was completely devoted to her, even as she treated him with what appeared to be contempt. It was as if he had to justify his decision to abdicate by maintaining the fiction that Wallis was worth it, that their love was special and transcendent. To admit that the relationship was hollow would be to admit that he had given up the crown for nothing. As Edward aged, he became increasingly isolated and bitter. His rare visits to Britain were tense and awkward. His brother George VI died in 1952, worn down by the stress of unexpected kingship. George VI's daughter became Queen Elizabeth II. She was dutiful where Edward had been selfish, dedicated where he had been frivolous. She represented everything Edward should have been, but wasn't. Elizabeth II's relationship with her Uncle Edward was correct, but cold. She allowed him to visit occasionally, but he was never truly welcomed back into the royal fold. The wounds from the abdication were too deep. The sense of betrayal was too strong. Edward had abandoned his duty, and his family could not forgive that. Wallis, meanwhile, was aging less gracefully. She became obsessed with her appearance, undergoing multiple cosmetic surgeries. She surrounded herself with younger men, some of whom were clearly more interested in her money and connections than in her. She seemed to live in a perpetual state of dissatisfaction, never content with what she had, always wanting more recognition, more status, more proof that she had been worth the king's sacrifice. Edward's health began to decline in the late 1960s. He was diagnosed with throat cancer, likely caused by his lifelong heavy smoking. He underwent surgery and treatment, but the cancer returned. By early 1972, he was clearly dying. In May 1972, Queen Elizabeth II was making a state visit to France. She made a point of visiting Edward at his Paris home. It was a gesture of reconciliation, a way of showing that family ties still mattered, despite everything that had happened. Edward was confined to his bed, gaunt and weak. The meeting was brief and bittersweet. Elizabeth was seeing her uncle for what she knew would be the last time. Edward VIII, Duke of Windsor, died on May 28, 1972, at age 77. His body was flown back to Britain for burial at Frogmore, near Windsor Castle. The funeral was a small, private affair, nothing like the grand state ceremonies that would have accompanied a king's death if Edward had never abdicated. Wallis attended, veiled and silent, looking old and lost. After Edward's death, Wallis lived on in the Paris mansion for another 14 years. But these were not good years. She became increasingly frail and confused, possibly suffering from dementia. She was cared for by staff and largely isolated from the outside world. Old friends stopped visiting. The glamorous social life she had once lived faded to nothing. Wallis died on April 24, 1986, at age 89. Like Edward, she was buried at Frogmore. Her funeral was attended by Queen Elizabeth II and other members of the royal family, a final gesture of respect, or perhaps closure. The woman who had caused a constitutional crisis and changed the course of British history was laid to rest next to the king who had given up his throne for her. What is Edward VIII's legacy? It's complicated and contested. To some, he represents the triumph of love over duty, a man who chose personal happiness over obligation and tradition. To others, he represents the failure of duty, a weak and selfish man who abandoned his responsibilities at a critical moment in history. The truth, I believe, lies somewhere in between. Edward was neither a romantic hero nor a simple villain. He was a profoundly damaged man who never received the love and emotional support he needed as a child, who spent his entire life seeking validation and affection, who latched onto a woman he believed could fill the void inside him, and who ultimately gave up everything for a relationship that never truly satisfied either person involved. Think about what Edward lost. He lost the throne of the British Empire. He lost his family's respect and affection. He lost any sense of purpose or meaning in his life. He lived in comfortable exile for 36 years, wealthy but aimless, famous but irrelevant, married but alone. Think about what he gained. A woman who, by most accounts, didn't truly love him as deeply as he loved her. A marriage that was often cold and strained, a life of endless social events and empty luxury, the knowledge that he would be remembered not for achievements, but for abdication. Was it worth it? Edward himself seems to have had doubts, though he rarely expressed them publicly. In his later years, friends reported that he would sometimes talk wistfully about what might have been if he had remained king. He would speak with pride about his brother George VI's leadership during World War II, but there was also sadness, a sense that this should have been his role, his moment to prove himself. He had given up the chance to lead Britain through its greatest crisis in centuries, and for what? For a woman who made cutting remarks about him at dinner parties? What strikes me most about Edward's story is how completely his childhood shaped his adult decisions. The cold, emotionally withholding parents, the desperate need for affection and validation, the pattern of seeking that affection from unavailable women, the inability to distinguish between love and obsession. All of this can be traced back to those early years when a small boy was taught that duty mattered more than feelings, that showing emotion was weakness, that he must always perform his role perfectly. Edward learned those lessons too well. He spent his entire life performing, the charming prince, the dashing heir, the romantic lover. But he never developed a genuine sense of self or purpose beyond the performance. So when he was forced to choose between his role and his relationship, he chose the relationship, not because it was healthier or more authentic, but because it was the only thing that made him feel needed and loved. The abdication crisis of 1936 changed the British monarchy forever. It demonstrated that even kings are human, capable of making catastrophically poor decisions. It showed that personal desire could indeed overcome duty, even at the highest levels of power and privilege. And it led to a strengthening of the monarchy's moral authority through the unexpected kingship of George VI and the eventual reign of Elizabeth II, both of whom embodied duty and service in ways Edward never could. But the abdication also raises uncomfortable questions that remain relevant today. Should anyone have to sacrifice personal happiness for duty? Is it fair to demand that individuals in positions of power live by different rules than everyone else? Can love ever truly be wrong if it's genuine and freely chosen? I think the answer is that these questions don't have simple solutions. Edward's situation was unique because of his position. He wasn't just a man making a personal choice. He was a king whose decisions had consequences for millions of people. His duty wasn't abstract. It was a real obligation to the British people, to the empire, to the institution of monarchy itself. And the relationship he chose wasn't some pure, transcendent love story. It was an obsessive attachment to a woman who was, by most accounts, domineering, cold, and possibly more interested in status than in Edward himself. He didn't choose love over duty. He chose emotional dependency over responsibility. That's not the same thing. Edward VIII's story is ultimately a tragedy, not because he gave up the throne, but because he spent his entire life running from himself. He never developed the inner strength or sense of purpose that might have allowed him to either fulfill his duty as king or build a genuinely happy life outside that role. He was trapped between two impossible choices, and he made the wrong decision for all the wrong reasons. The weight of the Windsor name couldn't protect Edward from his own psychological wounds. The grandeur of the British Empire couldn't fill the void left by an emotionally barren childhood. And Wallis Simpson, whatever her intentions, couldn't provide the unconditional love Edward so desperately sought. In the end, Edward had everything, and nothing. Looking at everything Edward VIII missed, the chance to lead his nation through war, the opportunity to modernize the monarchy on his own terms, the possibility of genuine family reconciliation, the decades of purposeful work he might have done, I think his story teaches us something important about the relationship between duty and happiness. We live in an era that often celebrates the pursuit of personal happiness above all else. We're told to follow our hearts, to prioritize our own needs, to choose love over obligation. And in many contexts, this is healthy and right. But Edward's story reminds us that sometimes duty matters. Sometimes our obligations to others, to family, to community, to the roles we've accepted, are real and important and can't be dismissed simply because they conflict with what we want. It also reminds us that we need to raise children with genuine emotional warmth and support. Edward's desperate need for affection, his inability to form healthy relationships, his obsessive attachments, all of this stemmed from a childhood devoid of the love and acceptance every child needs. If George V and Queen Mary had been warmer, more emotionally available parents, would Edward have made different choices? We can never know. But it's hard to escape the conclusion that his childhood wounds shaped his adult catastrophes. Edward VIII was more than just a tragic headline about a king who gave up his throne for love. He was a real person who suffered, who made terrible decisions, who lived with the consequences of those decisions for decades. He deserves to be remembered not just as the king who abdicated, but as a cautionary tale about the importance of emotional health, the weight of duty, and the difference between love and obsession. The throne Edward abandoned passed to his brother, then to his niece, Queen Elizabeth II, who would become Britain's longest reigning monarch and one of the most respected figures of the 20th century. The institution Edward thought he couldn't live without survived and even thrived without him. The woman he thought he couldn't live without gave him a cold, lonely exile that lasted nearly 4 decades. In the end, Edward VIII's choice wasn't between love and duty. It was between the hard work of building a meaningful life and the easy escape of romantic fantasy. He chose the fantasy, and he spent the rest of his life learning that fantasies, no matter how seductive, can never sustain us. If this story can help even one person understand the importance of facing difficult truths of building genuine emotional health, of recognizing the difference between love and dependency, then perhaps Edward's tragedy wasn't completely in vain. The crown he abandoned continues to shine. The love he chose has faded to dust. The lesson remains. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more fascinating stories.